From the professional writing program of NCSU and Triangle Chess, this is the second lesson on algebraic notation. The topics during this video will be as followed. Number 1, notation of the game board. Number 2, piece movement notation. Number 3, piece capture notation. Number 4, pawn promotion notation. And number 5, check and checkmate notation. There are 64 squares on a chessboard, and each one of them is marked by a unique coordinate pair, a lowercase letter and a number. The lowercase letter that makes up the first part of a chess square's location is named for the column it is in, otherwise known as the file. Pictured here is file A, highlighted in red. Highlighted in red is file B. Highlighted in red is file C. This is file D. This is file E. This is file F. This is file G. And this is file H, which is the last of the files. There are 8 in total. The second part of the pair that makes up a chess square's location is called the rank, which is the row it is in. Highlighted here in red is rank 1. There are 8 ranks in total. Rank 2. Rank 3. Rank 4. Rank 5. Rank 6. Rank 7. And finally, rank 8. What is the notation of the highlighted square? Remember that a chess square is identified first by its file, then its rank. You'll have a few seconds before the answer is shown. The square's notation is D5, D being the file and 5 being the rank. What would be the notation for this highlighted square? You'll have a few seconds to reply. The notation for the highlighted square is E8. One more quick problem. What is the location of the white queen, highlighted here in red? You'll have a few seconds before the answer is shown. The notation for the white queen is D1. In algebraic notation, every single chess piece on the chessboard has its own unique symbol. All the rooks are symbolized by the capital letter R. All the knights are symbolized by the capital letter N, but not K because that's reserved for a more important piece. All the bishops are symbolized by the capital letter B. The king is the piece that is symbolized by the capital letter K. And finally, the queen is symbolized by the capital letter Q. Don't worry, we didn't forget about the pawns, but they don't have a letter that symbolizes them in algebraic notation. Instead, pawns are referred to by their file, which as you remember are the columns that make up the chessboard. Now that we understand the notation for the squares on the chessboard as well as the pieces on the chessboard, Let's put the two together so that we can understand the notation for how pieces would move on a chessboard. There are two components to the notation of piece movement, and the first component is the symbol for the chess piece. The second part to piece movement notation is the coordinate of the destination of the chess piece you are moving. There are no spaces or any other kinds of punctuation between the two. For example, look at the black king currently located on square c6. Now if we were to move the king to square b5, it could be written as capital K, which is the king symbol, b5, which is the destination that it is being moved to. So here is one for practice. What would be the notation of this move? The knight that starts at b1 is moving to square c3. The correct answer is NC3, N being the knight symbol, C3 being the coordinates of the destination. Here's another example. What would be the notation for this move? The bishop is starting off on square F8. The correct answer is capital B, then lowercase b, then 4. Capital B being the bishop's symbol, and then lowercase b4 being the coordinate of the square. Here's another example. What would be the notation for this move? The rook, starting on space A3, is moving to space E3. The correct answer is capital R, E3. How about for this one? The white queen that starts on space D1 is moving to space D2. The correct answer is QD2. Here's a tricky one. Here we see a pawn moving from space E2 to space E4. Remember that pawns do not have a symbol of their own. So what would be the notation? The correct answer is merely E4. Because the pawn doesn't have a symbol to represent it, you merely put the coordinates of the square it is moving to. Now that we understand the notation for how chess pieces are moved, we can get into the notation for how chess pieces are captured. It is very similar to how chess pieces are moved, just with a little extra punctuation. In this move, the white rook at g3 is going to capture the black pawn at g7. The notation for this will be capital R, X, which is how you signify that a piece has been captured in algebraic notation, and then g7, which is the destination that the rook landed on. So what about for pawns that capture other pieces? Well, pawns don't have a symbol of their own, so they use the letter of their file that they are in when they are capturing a piece. Thus, the notation for this capture would be D, because that is the name of the file that the pawn was capturing from, then X, which denotes the capture, and then E5, which is the space that the pawn is capturing. With this knight, the notation for the capturing of the pawn is no different than any of the other ones. It is capital N, X, E4. So what do you do when two pieces that have the same symbol can both capture another piece? Well, in that case, you use their symbol. In this case, it would be R for rook. In addition, you add in the letter of their file. So if the rook that starts at A4 captures the piece, the notation would be capital N, and then A, because that's the file where the rook was coming from, and then X E4, which is the destination. If the rook that was on E1 captures the piece, the notation would be capital N, and then E, because it is in file E, X E4. So here's another special case. What if both pieces that can capture are in the same file and have the same symbol? In this case, you use the symbol of the bishop, B, and instead of the file, you use the rank number in order to tell a difference between the two. So when the other bishop captures the piece, it is B3 x F5 instead of B7 because they both have different ranks. So what about the notation for pawns that capture pieces? As you can see, both of these pawns have the same rank, 5, and both of them can capture the pawn that is on D4. Once again, since pawns have no symbol, you instead rely on their file to show when they are capturing a piece. So when the pawn from file E captures the piece, it is E x D4. So here's a practice problem. What would be the algebraic notation for this knight on F3 capturing this pawn on E5? It would be capital N because that's the knight's symbol, and then X because it's capturing a piece, and then E5 because that's the square it's landing on. So what would be the notation for this black king on E6 capturing this white knight on D5? And what about for this white pawn capturing the black pawn on G5? The correct notation would be little h, which is the symbol for the file, and then cross because it's capturing a piece, and G5 because that is the space where it captured the piece. So going back to a previous example, what would be the two ways you could write out these moves? If the first rook on H8 captures the piece, it would be written as capital R, and then little h because since there are two rooks that can capture the piece, you need to put in the file so that you can correctly identify which one is capturing, and then H1, which is the space that it is capturing on. The second way to write the notation for this capture would be using the other rook that was on A1, be capital R, and then A, since it is coming from file A, and then X H1. So going back to another previous example, what would be the notations for these captures involving these two knights that are on the same file? The first capture, with the knight that starts on D4, would be written as capital N, and then 4, because since both the knights are on the same file, you use the rank instead to tell the difference between the two. And the second knight, that starts off at D2, the capture would be written as capital N, and then 2, because that's the rank of the second knight, and then X F3, because it is capturing a space on F3. Pawn promotion is something that happens in chess games, but how do you write it in algebraic notation? The notation is the same as it is for standard pawn movement. However, at the very end of it, you put the symbol of the piece that you are transforming into. The notation for this pawn movement would be e8q. That's assuming we choose a queen for the pawn to be promoted into. But what happens if a pawn captures a piece into promotion? Well, in that case, it's written the same as it would be for any standard capture, except you put the symbol of the piece that it's promoting into at the end. So here's a quick example to try. What would be the notation for this pawn moving from a7 to a8? Assuming that a queen is the piece that we want the pawn to be promoted into, the notation for this move would be a8 and then q. Here's another example to try. What would be the notation for the black pawn's movement, assuming we want to promote it into a knight? The notation for this move would be f1 and then n. f1 being the space that the pawn moved to, and then capital N being the symbol of the unit it's being promoted into. One last example. What would be the notation for the white pawn capturing the black rook and then being promoted into a bishop? The correct notation for this movement would be fxg8, because that is the notation for the pawn, which is file f, capturing the rook on space g8, and then capital B because it is being promoted into a bishop. The last topic to cover in this video will be check and checkmate notation. Check and checkmate notation are not that different from simple movement notation. Basically, the entire notation is the same as movement notation, with an added plus at the very end to show that the king was put in check by that move. Once again, checkmate notation is the same as check notation, just with one extra detail. Basically, you use check notation, which is the movement notation with a plus sign, and then an additional plus sign to show that the king has been checkmated. Here's a practice problem. What would the notation for this movement be? The white bishop at f1 is going to put the black king in check. The correct notation for this move would be capital B and then b5 plus. Capital B being the symbol for the bishop, b5 being the space it is moving to, and then plus to show that the king was put in check by this move. So how does it work when a piece captures another piece into check? Well, it works pretty much like you'd expect. The notation is the same for a standard capture, except with the added plus to show that the king was put in check by this move. Here's another tricky one. What would be the notation for this move? The white pawn on f6 is capturing the black rook on g7 to put the black king in checkmate. The notation would be fx g7 because a pawn with file x is capturing a piece on the space g7, and then plus plus because the black king has been put in checkmate as a result of that move. Just a brief recap on everything you've learned during this video. Remember, every chessboard square is identified by its file letter and its rank number. Every chess piece has a letter symbol except for the pawn, which is identified instead by the letter of its file. The movement is the piece symbol and the square it's traveling to. Capturing notation is as simple as the same as the movement notation, but with an X between. Pawn promotion is the movement and the piece symbol at the very end to show what it is promoting into. And then check and checkmate are the same as the movement notation, but with pluses to notify how dire in need the king is. Thank you for watching our video. I hope you learned a lot and stay tuned for the next lesson.